Bangladesh's struggle against Pakistan was assimilated into a single global story about societies being liberated from foreign domination, which included India, Algeria, Vietnam, and Palestine. Pakistani elites who wanted a closer military alliance and backed the kind of policy advocated by Pakistani elites who wanted a closer military alliance with the Western powers. Just as it was silly to think Indonesians were not good Muslims, so it was absurd, he said, to suggest there was anything less Islamic about Bengali than Urdu. So Jinnah was not able to straightforwardly impose his vision of a Pakistani nation state, and he was dead before its constitution was decided. Mujib's tone was very different from that of his fellow Awami League leader Surwadi 8 years earlier. Saying to the minister, and it was how I was going to open anyway, that history in parts of the world like Bangladesh is not just history. The past is kind of essentially part of people's lives. It's essential to the categories with which people live our lives and to the struggles that people have fought. And with that, I too should pay my respects to the martyrs of the language movement and the liberation war as well. I want though to, my talk is going to be related to some degree to the language movement, although I want to kind of place it in a broader context, a broader local and also global political context. And I want to both kind of show how the place we are now is very much kind of indebted to history, but also think about the differences, the ruptures, the changes that have occurred over the last 50, 75 or more years, and kind of, I suppose, put some, flies in the ointment or challenges there to kind of to the historical narratives that we're familiar with in some ways. Because one of the points I'm going to make in a moment is that the language movement was embedded within a politics that was about creating a very different kind of political constitution than the kind of constitution that we're living in now, than the kind of politics we're engaged in now, and I'll explain that in a moment. Let me begin my talk properly. Sometime in 1975 or 1976, the rain started to pour in a village in northern Bangladesh. A foreign scholar studying the causes of poverty in the new nation state opened his umbrella. This very ordinary incident sparked debate amongst the villagers who saw it. Where did the umbrella come from? Was it American? Was it Soviet? Was the economist the agent of a foreign power which was linked to this umbrella? If so, which? That incident, told by the development economist James Boyce a number of years ago, illustrates one overwhelming way in which Bangladesh's relationship with the world beyond has been understood. From the point of view of that perspective of those kind of, from that point of view, Bangladesh's emergence in 1971 and its existence afterwards was shaped by its relations with regional and global powers. Everything from umbrellas to ideologies, with development aid and infrastructure in between, in that context is seen as coming from or shaped by somewhere else. About those things, the perspective I'm thinking about poses for Bangladesh the question the villagers asked. And it's a question that anyone who reads the sort of international relations of the history of Bangladesh or some histories of Bangladesh will know. The USA or the Soviet Union, India or China, the secular liberal West or the Islamic world. That kind of perspective presents the history of Bangladesh always as a series of binary either-or options which assume that you can only ever be in one camp or on one side. So one has a pro-Russian phase, a pro-American phase, etc. Those questions may be useful for some politicians, although in some ways not the current regime, I don't think, in rhetorically defining who to polarize for or against, deciding who's a friend or who an enemy. But reality, even for political leaders, is always much more complex. And the kind of argument that I'm making here, and the point that I want to share with you, is that you don't have to choose. That I want to think about the history of Bangladesh outside of those binary oppositions that often we're so familiar with, and to suggest that, if you like, the kind of the movement for Bangladesh, the process that led to the emergence of Bangladesh was about not making those choices, America, Soviet Union, etc. It was about Bangladesh being itself on its own, but within a world which wasn't defined by those kind of binary oppositions. Non-alignment, if you like. And that phrase global south, which in a sense is a part of a binary opposition, north-south, but nonetheless it's a way of thinking about the world of states without moving beyond the kind of categorizations that I've been talking about, and in a way, those are categories that we're back with: USA, China, India, China, etc. And my point really is that Bangladesh has a long and rich history of being itself without being sucked into those kind of divisions. Anyway, I'm going to trace two interconnected stories in my words. First, I'm going to briefly talk about the history of Bangladeshi self-determination. And I'll come back to that word self-determination in a moment. Secondly, though, I'll talk about the story of Bangladesh's relationship with other societies in what we now call the global south. As I said, the argument here is that the history of Bangladeshi self-determination was closely entwined with the history of Bangladeshi society's relationship with the world outside. You can't get away from needing to think about how this place engages with the world beyond. But Bangladesh's existence as a nation-state was not produced by great power politics. It was largely produced by the assertion of people in this place, in this land, but not only that, but also, and to a degree we often forget, Bangladesh's existence was forged alongside a conversation about the relationship with other societies in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, as I said, what we now call the global south. Those societies were very different in their ideology, in their social structure, in their identity, but they share a common concern to assert their autonomous capacity to shape their destiny for themselves. And, as I'll end by saying, by the early 1970s, they shared a common set of arguments about the form in which that capacity for self-determination should be exercised. So let me begin then by thinking about that idea of self-determination. It's a phrase that has a long history, but it's, I argue in the book that I'm writing, the most important theme, it defines the most important theme in the history of politics since the middle of the 20th century to the present day. The Second World War was fought as a war between empires, between the German, Japanese, Italian empires against Anglo-American empires. A conflict that in some ways was between different forms of domination, though, fueled aspirations for autonomy. It drove movements for self-determination in thousands of places throughout the world. That spirit for independence and autonomy still drove what Kamal Hussein, when he was speaking in the United Nations in 1974, called the overwhelming majority of mankind. This was a world that, as Hussein put it, is emerging from servitude to freedom, from exploitation towards economic emancipation, from dependence to self-reliance. But this is the key point that I want to stress, and this is what I want to suggest is how the past is different from the present. When the Second World War ended, even in 1947 or 1948, there was no agreement about what form freedom, emancipation, or self-reliance should take. The nation-state was not then accepted as the universal form of global society, either by the old imperial powers, who of course didn't want national independence, or by people struggling to free themselves from imperial domination either. Many, indeed, argued that the lessons of the turbulent 20 years before, with the Depression, with the rise of fascism, with World War II, was that nation-states would be too weak and too fragile to withstand the pressures of the post-war world. Instead, leaders from across the world proposed that the collapsing European empires should be succeeded by new multinational, often federal states. So federal schemes, we forget about the importance of federalism as an idea, in politics, but it was crucial in the middle of the 20th century. Federal schemes were everywhere in the 1940s. A number of different proposals were put forward to federate the societies of Southeast and South and Central Europe, with one vision, for example, connecting Greece to Poland in a single multinational regime. In the last days of the Japanese Empire, nationalists in Indonesia and Malaya proposed uniting the Malay-speaking world in a single federal polity that would stretch from Aceh to New Guinea. Federations were created in the West Indies and West and Central Africa. Federal proposals were discussed for the Indian subcontinent, of course, and until partition was announced, everyone imagined that India was going to be a federation. Federation was the most common word in Calcutta University's political science exams in 1946. I haven't looked at Dhaka University, but I imagine the same is true. Federalism was the most common topic in the first issues of the recently founded Indian Journal of Political Science. So these possibilities, this idea of the arguments about federalism, assumed that self-determination could occur in multiple different ways under a single form of sovereignty. Multiple different communities could develop their own society, economy, and culture in a state that, as far as the outside world was concerned, was a single regime. Sovereignty and self-determination. So self-determination is, people's aspirations for freedom to govern their own affairs. Sovereignty, central, supreme political power, did not need necessarily to overlap. They didn't need to exist in the same kind of entity, if that makes sense. So if you read the Charter of the United Nations, the concepts of sovereignty and self-determination are separate. They're discussed in different sections. Self-determination was an aspiration in Article 1, which laid out the UN's purpose as to develop friendly relations among nations based upon respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, but upholding the sovereign right of states, including empires, to manage the domestic affairs of their globally dispersed territories, was a principle laid down in Article 2, which the imperial powers, Britain and the Netherlands, etc., initially used to try and oppose granting independence to their colonies, or at least to argue that they should be in control of the process of granting independence to their colonies. So self-determination and sovereignty were two separate concepts. So what does this have to do with South Asia, with India, with Bangladesh? The partition of India is usually seen as the death of these kind of federal ideas and arguments about South Asia. Of course, one of partition's leading architects, maybe I should caveat that, but let's call him that for the moment, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, argued in 1942 that federalism could not work in the subcontinent. India was not a national state, or British India was not a national state, but instead a subcontinent composed of multiple nationalities. Those who are arguing in favor of a federal way of governing India would say, fine, we'll just have a single federal state which allows, accommodates those different nationalities, but Jinnah disagreed. For him, the fact that India was made up of multiple peoples, multiple languages, multiple, as he said, nationalities, meant that it needed to be divided into multiple separate states, each representing a unitary culture and national identity. Pakistan, for him, single language was one. Partition happened, but this is my point. Federalism did not die. It lived on in debates about the future of Pakistan. Jinnah was not able to straightforwardly impose his vision of a Pakistani nation state, and he was dead before its constitution was decided. The character and structure of the new Pakistani state was fiercely contested in the first decade of its existence, with federal arguments playing a strong role in the debate. And my point that I'm coming to is that in the early 50s, the language movement was an argument for a federal Pakistan. The vision of the politicians around Surawadi, Bashani, and Mujib, etc., who created the Awani League, was of a multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic, multi-religious, in some senses multinational state. The dominance of those arguments in Dhaka in 1947 explains the gasp of surprise with which Jinnah's insistence on Urdu and only Urdu was received when he mentioned it was going to be the sole language at the racecourse meeting. So there were 48, sorry, not 47, I'm getting my dates wrong. And the thousands who participated in the language movement in 1952 from many different organizations were asserting Bengali self-determination, were arguing that Bengalis should be able to, determine their own lives with their own language, but doing so within an argument about a culturally and politically federal vision of Pakistan. And so this vision, this idea of a plural, multilinguistic federal Pakistan was based on a particular understanding of Pakistan's relationship with the world beyond. It's not just about what's going on in Bengal or Pakistan. It envisaged Pakistan as one of a number of predominantly Muslim states made up of peoples with multiple overlapping identities. And the frequency with which people like Mujib to some degree Surawadi, actually talk about those other states. Indonesia, for example, is striking. The countries of Asia and the Middle East were not seen as homogenous communities for them, demarcated exactly by state boundaries. Instead, for them, language, identity could be separate from religion, territory, and state power. So, for example, in the 1956 debate about Pakistan's constitution, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman ridiculed the idea that Pakistan's Muslim character forced it to adopt a particular national language. Muslims in Indonesia, in India, or in Iran were no less Muslim because they spoke multiple different local languages. Just as it was silly to think Indonesians were not good Muslims, so it was absurd, he said, to suggest there was anything less Islamic about Bengali than Urdu. So I think there's an international politics behind the language movement and behind the kind of arguments that Awami League politicians are making in this point. But Mujib went on saying that Pakistan was not only a Muslim society. It had large Christian and Hindu populations who were good Pakistani citizens, but shared a religious identity with people elsewhere. So this, and going back to my opening point, this vision of Pakistan rejected the construction of stark dichotomies within or beyond Pakistani society. For Mujib and his colleagues, Pakistan's existence did not depend on a polarizing against India, or on a choosing of sides in the Cold War, or constructing a rigid opposition between Muslims and non-Muslims. Instead, for Mujib and for his colleagues, Pakistan was imagined as an independent federal state made up of multiple communities enmeshed in strong relations with a multiplicity of nearby societies, including both India and also the Muslim world. As Surawadi put it in September 1956, we are anxious to be on friendly terms with all countries, chiefly with our neighbours, and you can only mean India there, and our brother Muslims. Pakistan edged a little closer to having the kind of plural federal constitution which would have enabled Bengali self-determination in the mid-1950s. Linguistic pluralism was accepted by the Constituent Assembly in 1954, as Bengali was accepted as a state language. The mid-1950s saw traces of other possible futures for Pakistan in its relationship with the rest of the world too. Pakistan was one of the 5 Asian countries, along with Burma, Indonesia, India, and Ceylon, invited by the Ceylonese Prime Minister in 1954 to discuss greater cooperation throughout Asia. And I think often we have this story of non-alignment and the move for sort of close Asian cooperation in the 50s and 60s, and it's Nehru who's the driving force, always. I think it's always important to diminish the importance of Nehru. He gets too much press. There's all sorts of other people who are arguing for cooperation. Ceylon, who soon in Sri Lanka, is a driving force. Indonesia is a really driving force within these kind of activities. The Muslim League had boycotted the Asian Relation Conference instigated by Nehru, which met in Delhi in 1947. But as the initiative for Pan-Asian collaboration moved away from India, Pakistani leaders from East and West wings, both, supported initiatives which brought the former colonized countries together to support peace and prosperity in the region. And I think there may be, but I haven't done enough work to figure this out yet, more of a role of people from East Pakistan in these kind of conversations, these Pan-Asian conversations, than the West. Certainly it's the West Pakistani kind of military elite who finds them uncomfortable, as I'll go on to say. The Colombo meeting led to the more famous Bandung Conference the following year, to which African as well as Asian societies were invited. The 29 states which gathered across what we now call the Global South shared a common concern to accelerate the end of colonialism, to limit Western dominance, to work together to build an emphatically post-imperial world. Pakistan's representatives believed that they played a critical role preventing Nehru from, quote, selling the past to the communists in Asia. At Bandung, Ceylon, soon to be Sri Lanka, and Pakistan worked together to ensure that the universally shared antipathy to Western empire amongst the participants didn't tilt into a pro-communist, pro-Soviet bias. At Bandung, Pakistan and Ceylon formulated an anti-communist but also strongly post-colonial vision of cooperation within the Global South, which then is kind of forgotten. In his report from the Bandung Conference, significantly called Beyond Left and Right, again trying to break down those polarities, the African-American Richard Wright reported having a long conversation with a young Pakistani man. Wright's interlocutor, who he doesn't name, insisted now that Pakistan is free, it had no enemies. The gathering at Bandung was a moment which would allow, quote, Asia and Africa to lead mankind after centuries of Western dominance. The Pakistani youth, we don't know whether he came from East or West Pakistan, in fact, said, in fact, though, Pakistan did have an enemy, or at least it thought it, or at least many thought it did. Just like France with Germany and Israel with its Arab neighbours, the foreign policy of Pakistan had been quote, dominated by considerations of security and independence from its neighbour, India, as K. Sarwar Hassan, the prominent scholar of Pakistan's international relations, wrote. Pakistan's, quote, obsession with India, the phrase comes from the Indian diplomat Sisir Gupta, writing in 1960, caused its elite to centralize power within Pakistan and to take highly polarized positions to the world outside. The result was the annihilation of the possibility of Bengali self-determination within a federal Pakistan, because, as we all know, the Bengali language was seen as too Indian, etc., and the corrosion of the corrosion of good relations with Asian neighbours that such a federal constitution would rely on. My point is that a kind of decentered federal plural Pakistan was depended upon a kind of a close relationship with neighbours with the global south, and that's what Pakistan's obsession with India, its need always to polarize, or the Pakistani leadership's sense of the need to polarize against India prevented from happening. So, how did that occur? Pakistan's economic relations with India collapsed after the country decided not to devalue its currency in line with the pound sterling and the Indian rupee in 1949. That act didn't have immediate short-term effects because it was hidden by the global boom that was caused by the Korean War, which led to greater demand for the jute and cotton which Pakistan exported. But by 1952, Pakistan had instituted massive exchange controls, massively curtailed trade with India, locking the country out of friendly relations, economic terms with its neighbours, including, of course, India. And that had a far greater effect on the East and the West, on Bengal than Punjab, for example, because East Pakistan was much more closely enmeshed and entangled within economic connections with India. 80% of India's exports, of East Pakistan's exports, or its trade, in 1949 was with India. So Bengal suffered harshly from this breakdown, which fueled, influenced the kind of liberation movement. So, secondly, Pakistan's antagonistic relationship with India also led it to ally more strongly with Britain and the United States, alienating newly independent countries in the global south. So Pakistan had been tilting towards the west since the early 50s, seeing the UK and India and United States as the best hope of financial and military support to protect it against its larger neighbour. But there were still other possible lines of collaboration and connection with the global south, with the non-aligned what's beginning to be called the Third World. 2 months before the Bandung Conference, Pakistan joined a defensive alliance with three then strong Anglo-American allies, Turkey, Iraq, and Iran, along with the UK, and tried to encourage other Arab states to join. Throughout 1950, 55, and 1956, and I think these are the key moments, though, talk was of mutual support amongst the pro-Western Muslim states of the Middle East, as much as their dependence on Britain and the US. But it was the Suez Crisis in the autumn of 1956, when Egypt's new leader, Nasser, nationalized the Suez Canal, and first Israel and then Britain and France invaded, that put those relations under pressure. HSS Surawadi was appointed Prime Minister, and initially, as someone who believed in a strong relationship with the region, with other states, etc., and also with the Muslim world, someone who I think didn't want to polarize, he tried to maintain a balanced position to Suez, supporting Egypt's right to control a commercial operation in its own territory, while also insisting that the canal needed to stay open. But Surawadi was pulled in different directions. The largely Bengali members of the Awami League, led by Maulana Bashani, called for solidarity with the post-imperial world, and supported Egypt's right to control the canal. West Pakistani military and bureaucratic elites, by contrast, were paranoid about close relations between India and the Soviet Union and wanted Pakistan to support Britain. Nehru wrote to Surawadi proposing that India and Pakistan, together with the other Colombo powers, work together to develop a joint African and Asian solution to the Suez Crisis. But Surawadi rebuffed Nehru's offer and jumped west to side with Britain. Pakistani elites who wanted a closer military alliance and backed the kind of policy advocated by Pakistani elites who wanted a closer military alliance with the Western powers. In doing so, he ended up taking a more aggressive line against Nasser's Egypt than the United States. Egypt was of course turning into a major ally of India, and both were developing stronger connections with the USSR. Surawadi was in a weak position, and felt that the only way he could survive was by supporting the kind of the policy, the kind of sort of pro-Western, pro-British sort of anti-Egyptian policy of and if you like, anti-third world policy of the kind of the military and bureaucratic elite in the West wanted. So you kind of understand why he did what he did. And against this threatening coalition of the USSR and India, the Pakistani leadership and also Suhrawardi thought a gathering of Asian and African nations could do very little. The solution for them to Pakistan's security dilemma lay in courting the support of the world's strongest powers. So when asked why the states of the global south didn't cooperate to solve problems in their regions themselves, why, in other words, don't we get together rather than be tied to a big power like the UK or America, Suhrawardi was dismissive. My answer is 0 plus 0 plus 0 is, after all, equal to that 0. And of course, it's Suhrawardi's kind of like close movement to Britain and to the West that then leads to the kind of split in the Awami League and the end of Suhrawardi's government, and feeds into the kind of events that lead to the sort of 1958 coup, in which that polarization against India and Pakistan against India and towards the West, and if you like, against closer relations with the global South, kind of really is emphatically pushed forward. And the chain of events that we all know very well, that leads to kind of 1971 sort of unfolds kind of in the concentration of power with the sort of military bureaucratic elite, and so on. Let me skip forward though, after having so far I've talked about the politics of the 1950s and the kind of language movement as a moment that's kind of arguing for a different vision of Pakistan from the one that comes into being, that of a kind of federal, multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic state in which Bengalis could their aspirations for self-determination would be successfully met. And I've told a story about how how that sort of vision came to an end, and argued that kind of Pakistan's obsession with India and the way in which even someone like Suhrawardi gets pulled into that sort of politics of polarizing against India and sort of preventing closer cooperation across the global South kind of was crucial within that, within the death of that sort of that broader federal non-aligned vision. But let me skip forward. I'm not going to narrate the what happens in between, because all far better than me. So, on 25th of September 1974, the Prime Minister of the newly elected member of the United Nations, Bangladesh, spoke to the United Nations General Assembly. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman spoke in Bengali. And it's the first occasion I can see, anyway, I haven't been through, when a speech was given to the United Nations main council chamber in a language other than that of the great powers. So this is a big moment. Mujib's tone was very different from that of his fellow Awami League leader Suhrawardi 8 years earlier. Mujib argued that liberation was the culmination of, quote, a struggle by the Bengali people to, quote, vindicate their right to self-determination, which he argued had been fought over centuries. In doing so, speaking to representatives from the majority of states in the global South who occupied seats in the General Assembly, Mujib associated Bangladesh's liberation with the universal struggle for peace and justice by the oppressed people throughout the world. So instead of a complicated understanding of the balance of power which Suhrawardi had articulated, Mujib described global politics as a simple fight replicated everywhere in the world. That fight was between freedom and self-determination on the one hand and colonial occupation on the other. Bangladesh's struggle against Pakistan was assimilated into a single global story about societies being liberated from foreign domination, which included India, Algeria, Vietnam, and Palestine. So in the account which Mujib and other leaders from the former colonized world gave of the struggle between oppression and liberation, the role of the United Nations was reinterpreted and described as emphatically on the side of freedom and independence. Rather than being a vague aspiration, as it certainly was for the leaders of Western powers in 1945. The United States Charter mention of the right to self-determination was reinterpreted by Mujib and others as a firm promise, redeemed, quote, through the supreme sacrifice of millions of valiant freedom fighters. The assumption here was that self-determination for Bengalis as for other oppressed peoples could only occur through the creation of a separate nation-state. Here, territory, culture and language and political institutions had all become aligned. The state reflected the aspiration of an apparently homogeneous society with a common shared language for freedom in a political form. And my point is that the language movement was not the you can't plot an easy straight line necessarily from the kind of politics of the language movement to that assumption about the relationship between language and sovereignty.